What was the Gearspace like before YouTube? I got on a call with Mark Rita, who has a lot more experience with the online Gearspace way before the explosion of YouTube. He moderated the synthesizer subreddit from 2012 to 2016 and watched it grow into a notable space online for gear and synth content. And he actually saw one of my videos, my take on the current state of the synthesizer subreddit, which is something we touch on a little bit in this video as well. If you'd like the much more unedited version of this discussion with Mark, the entire discussion is over on my Patreon, so here's a link to that. And it's also linked in the description of this video. I'm someone who's a lot newer to this space. I only really got involved around 2018, which was, YouTube was already super popular at that point. So it was just nice to have a different and much more rooted perspective, let's say, and to understand how YouTube affected this whole online and even offline gear space for better or for worse. But this timeline goes way back pretty much to the beginning of the internet. Why did people gravitate towards creating electronic music in the first place? Let's hear what Mark had to say about it.
Synths were always the cutting edge. And, the guys at Roland, when they created some of the drum machines, they were invented or developed to replace a drummer. And they weren't anywhere near that. That's what the 303 bass line was all about. It's supposed to replace a bassist. Didn't really accomplish it. But it was throwing technology at music and making it replace people. In the bands I've tried to be in the past, guys are flaky. And I just started realizing that, I can do it myself if I use a drum machine, if I use a synth, if I can layer music. And then dealing with flaky musicians who don't show up to practice or who just aren't really in the same vibe, you don't have to cater to them. You can be on your own, make your own music. And I think what ended up happening in the 90s, people were making music and they were doing so without a vocalist. Techno was coming out. And even when Daft Punk released their music, there was essentially, I think it was one of the first albums that didn't have a vocalist. So they kind of proved it that you don't need a vocalist and you can rely on the technology. And that's where things were going.
Bringing it back today on this channel, just thinking of all the people that I've featured who have maybe 3 or 4 units and they've constructed an entire set with those 3 or 4 units. That's pretty amazing. You could just as easily do everything with a laptop, Ableton Live, and 1 or 2 MIDI controllers, drums, bass, synth pads, synth leads, samples, vocal sampling, all at your fingertips. So that's where we are today after probably 40 plus years of electronic gear development. One could argue though that we are in a golden age of electronic music gear, just in terms of how much it's improved over the past decade or so. I personally believe that exposure through YouTube has been a huge contributor to this. But just in terms of the landscape of the internet in the early or mid 90s, what was the online gear space like before YouTube?
You're talking about people who like technology and gravitate towards technological advancements in music. What more natural connection is there than an emerging internet? So where are these people going to congregate? And at that time, I think of mailing lists. That was where a lot had happened. The other thing, it was the newsgroups.
Newsgroups is basically like a forum?
It was like a forum. Usenet, I think they called it. But essentially, it was an all-text basis. There were like subgenres within subgenres. alt.music.synthesizer or alt.music.pop.synthesizer, and you can kind of go down from there. It was essentially a forum before the forums existed. And then what started popping up were forums. There were so many different brands, so many different genres of music, so many different styles. It became difficult to really find a community that worked for you unless you tried to make your own.
I feel like a lot of live DJs or even live electronic music artists, they have that same sort of concept. Like, for example, I've been listening a lot to Ellen Allien. She's like a techno DJ, and she mentioned that exact concept that you just said. Like, you kind of have to create your own community because there's so many different communities happening and they're like very tight knit. So it's like you kind of have to do your own thing. So it's interesting how that same sort of thing is happening online. It's almost like that's just human behavior and it's manifested itself online, and it does the same thing in person or at live events.
On a similar vein of this topic, what was it like to learn a new synth during this time? In the year 2024, going on to 2025, the overload of information on any given new synth is what makes it really difficult to choose. It's just like having too many choices and lots of overlapping in function from one piece of gear to the next. But pre-YouTube in the year 2010, 2000, or even in the 90s, what was it like to just find the right piece of gear for you, given that access to related information was so much less accessible? Here's Mark's take.
It was more obscure. It was harder to learn about synths and learn about how to use them in a way that was in a style that you prefer. So if you were into like some kind of house music or techno, you wouldn't find someone using it in that style. How do you decide what instrument is right for you? By coming across people who make the same music or making the same music you want to make. And at one time I was into trance, and what do? You have to start emulating what other musicians do. So maybe that also means buying gear. So that's why I bought a JP8000. So how do I get that sound? Oh, JP8000 does that. And if you can't come across examples of individuals using those instruments, then you may never know. The only way you could do that is by watching music videos. And you'd see if they were in a live performance scenario, you would see that they were using a synth. Chances are they were actually using that synth.
Again, sort of unexpectedly, this kind of ties you back into that human behavior of being in a community. Just like an artist or a group of artists having to create their own community in terms of putting on performances or shows or parties. Decades ago, if you didn't have access to specific gear for, let's say, that trance sound, or if you didn't have the budget to purchase that gear, the reality was that you'd have to resort to using a more affordable instrument and kind of do your own thing with it. It seemed like because it was so obscure, you'd have to sort of meet someone with that piece of gear to fully understand what it did and to sort of immerse yourself into the style of music that piece of gear creates. That being said, sometimes investing in that less capable gear, which may have some limitations, is where the fun begins.
My first synth was a Korg X3. It was the successor to the Korg 01W. It had a lot of limitations, but I would look for ways to do things. And it didn't have resonance control and filter cutoff, but you could kind of recreate that if you assigned the joystick to a distortion effect. I was using two hands to play the synth, and I'd tie a string to the joystick controller, and I would tie it to my leg and then try to move my leg in a way that it would activate it. And there was, I was like a 16-year-old kid just trying to figure this out and try to make it work and try to do what Daft Punk would do, or Josh Wink was doing, making music and making instruments squeal a little bit. And sometimes you get creative. And limitations, I think, can be a great thing because it forces you to find ways around it.
It's pretty obvious that learning gear 100% on your own using very dry manuals written by engineers and no existence of YouTube videos, it was obviously just a lot more difficult and time consuming. I'm assuming that people who knew how to operate something like, let's say, just the TR-808, Dr. Dre, for example, was notorious for being a great 808 user. These people at the time were probably super valuable in the studio. It's kind of like the equivalent of a taxi driver knowing his or her way around before the invention of Google Maps. But in terms of the sound of the synths or drum machines that you were using, they were just built differently back then. Mind you, they were built like bricks. A lot of analog synths were super dense sounding. So how did one achieve that sort of polished sound that pretty much comes out of units of today right out of the box?
It was really hard to generate that sound.
Right.
If you were looking for a polished sound out of a synth from the 70s, 80s, 90s, good luck. You're not going to find it. That polishing is happens in the studio. You're wondering why your instrument or your little production that's maybe done on the onboard sequencer just doesn't sound right. Now gear has that polished sound to it because that's what eventually happens. People want it to sound that way. They want it to sound like an underground record, or they want it to sound like something that could be easily released without a dozen hours or a couple dozen hours in a professional studio. That was always a challenge because you had to really be insightful and see through the music. And it's like, how could I get that sound? How can I develop that tone without that polishing?
Let's bring it back to the present now, the Gearspace today. What are the pros and cons of being exposed to the sheer amount of gear content on a daily basis through YouTube and other platforms as well? The YouTube algorithm is literally pushing our interests into our faces every time that we're on the platform. Obviously, buying too much gear, or in my opinion, overlapping gear in terms of function, takes away from the core foundational reason of buying that gear in the first place, being creative with the gear, especially seeing that the gear today is so complex and time consuming, and there's like so much happening in such a small space. There's always, dual functions and all these different things you have to look into. There's definitely a fine line, which as an individual, I think you have to sort of discover between gear that will benefit you in the long run versus gear that's just going to be sitting in your closet for 2 years and then you'll sell it. You really do have to invest time and energy into finding the gear that will work within your whole process. Are companies just repackaging stuff and selling it to us through slick marketing? Just the fact that it's true, everything is kind of sounding the same in terms of synth gear. And in some cases, it's very blatant. So for example, Roland drum sound sounds like the TR-808, the TR-909, especially, let's say, the TR-909 in techno music. It's been used predominantly for 3 decades now.
The sounds are all the same. Now it's really about the interface and the workflow of the interface. That's what kind of makes the difference. So for me, I can only really talk about the things that I've really dug into. So Electron gear, I love. I'm really into the analog rhythm now. And for me, it's just like, it kind of gives you everything in one unit. You have your analog sounds, which I think sound great. You could sample stuff over top of that. The sequencer is insane. From my perspective, someone who's like reviewing gear and has looked at a bunch of gear, that's the difference. But the sounds it's true, they've kind of all been done.
There's also the notion of integration between software and even other hardware units. How well is Instrument X integrated with whatever popular, let's say, software of that time? Electron and, let's say, Overbridge, their software that integrates with all the major DAWs. Arturia with their soft synths, Roland with the Roland Cloud, which is essentially a software version of all their classics. They have a genius workflow with the current TR drum machines, so the TR6S as well as the TR8S, because they know that most artists who may even perform produce in their DAWs, and so they've included a TR software which is integrated with the hardware units. If you're the average producer producing in your DAW, you use this software to compose your beats, and you could export those beats into the hardware standalone unit and then maybe use that in a live setting. That sort of integration is just so convenient, and that seems to be the new thing that all these companies are selling. The same goes with hardware to hardware integration. It's no longer, oh, look at how X artist is using that really cool synth. It's now, look at how that artist is integrating several pieces of hardware together to create a full live set. And an important point to include here, especially with the integration of hardware, how efficiently is that specific unit able to sync up with or control other units? Personally, I have sold units that are lacking in this department for this reason alone, so it's just something that's really important.
Yeah, everyone wants to talk about gear. Gear is great. Gear is fun. Gear is exciting. Everyone wants something new, but it can cause a little bit of this lust where you just want to have more and more gear. Does it make you a better musician? I'm going to say no, it doesn't.
No,
but
no, it doesn't.
If you can be a good musician or learn to be a good musician with minimal tools, that's truly what I think where a good musician stands apart from the crowd, where they can make any instrument sound amazing. Someone strumming away on a $15 guitar, it just sounds like noise, but then you hand it to someone who really knows how to hold a guitar and manipulate it, they can make that $15 guitar sound amazing. So you see the same thing with any instrument. I know you're a drummer, you play a certain drum in a certain way, and you can really bring life out of it.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, it even translates into like sequencers. Like if I hear rhythm, I could plug it into a sequencer immediately. Honestly, being a drummer and then switching to electronic music, it gives me such an advantage because electronic music is so rhythmic. What I'm into now is techno, and techno is basically just drum grooves. So yeah, for me, it was just a perfect transition.
There's a bit of nuance here, especially when it comes to hardware. If you're a producer or even a performer, all you really need is Ableton Live. It's infinitely more powerful than any piece of gear or any combination of pieces of gear. It's way more convenient. It's less time consuming. And so the skilled guitar player to skilled Ableton user it's kind of an apples to apples comparison in the context of this video. But in my opinion, when it comes to hardware, especially in a performance setting, it's no longer an apples to apples comparison. Because at least in my opinion, the quality of the hardware that you're using really does have an effect on the music that you produce or that you perform, just because of how limited you are with a standalone piece of gear. Those limits will absolutely shape the kind of music and maybe even the quality of music that you create, produce, or perform. So for example, using an Electron sequencer versus a standalone EP133. That's a big difference, and monetarily you're paying for that difference. Using the analog rhythm versus the drum brute impact as a drum machine, again, big price difference, but also big difference in the quality of the sounds of the units, the workflow of the units, the engineering that goes into the units. Huge difference in capability. So in the end, it always goes back to that point of just take the time, do some research, And the best place to do research for these sorts of things is on YouTube. And also, again, no matter what combination of gear that you have, if you still feel like you want to unlock things, unlock certain limits creatively, just go with Ableton Live. It's a lot more affordable as well. So that's the trade-off. The next topic in regards to the current state of the online gear space, the synthesizers subreddit part of Mark and my conversation. I guess this little section is kind of like a sequel to that video. I believe that since Mark left over the years, it's become a bit of a toxic place on the internet, but it's still relevant. It's still a relevant spot to post content to sort of keep up to date with. There's over 350,000 people in that subreddit, so yeah, it's relevant. Before getting into this whole topic though, let's talk about today's sponsor, DistroKid. All these topics, Gearspace, creativity, might equate to you wanting to release music officially on all major streaming platforms. So how do you do that? You find a distributor to do that. DistroKid is the best option for independent artists like myself, possibly you. They are super affordable. There's a discount in the description of this video if you sign up using it. Here's a few reasons why they're great. In terms of what's new, they recently released a smartphone app, which makes checking your important DistroKid stats easy and accessible. The app is now available on Android through the Play Store. Essentially everything that you've been able to do on the DistroKid desktop app, you're now able to do through your smartphone. In fact, here's a list of key features that the app offers you. You might want to pause it now if you want to check them out. In today's day and age, we all know how many hats we have to wear as artists and producers. It can just be a lot, so write the music, produce the music. Then you've got to create content to promote it a few weeks before it's released. Then you've got to continue creating content after it's been released to promote it. It's a lot, and I'm not saying that DistroKid does all of this work for you, but they do make it a lot easier for us with the free promotional tools that they offer. The one I use most is Hyperfollow. It's essentially a free landing page or link tree. It's super clean. You could link maybe your latest video, your latest single, other important links you'd like to lead people to. I also use promo cards whenever I release a single. Just select the single that you would like to promote and it'll auto-generate a few different options for you to choose from. Go with DistroKid. It's just over $20 a year to release unlimited music to all major streaming platforms. You keep 100% of your streaming royalties. So many other tools that they offer for someone who's independent. They're made for us. And there is a discount linked in the description of this video if you would like to join. The rise and fall of the synthesizers subreddit.
I had a job where I had a lot of time. I was able to spend pretty much half the day on Reddit, and it didn't affect my performance at work. And I really did spend a lot of time governing and making sure that things stay positive within the group, and then establishing, rules for the group. I didn't want anybody just dropping a picture of their setup. If you're going to drop a picture of your setup, you better be there answering questions about the setup and how you use it and the type of music you make. If you just want to drop a photo and leave, no, that's your post is going to get deleted. So I had a lot of time to devote to enforcing these types of ideas and cutting out some of the negative talk and banning people or, giving them warnings and letting them know that we're serious. So those were the real things. And then all of a sudden people knew it was a place that they can go to. I remember one day I was watching Sonic State and they said, hey, Reddit synthesizer group's been a really good place to get information. And I was like, yes, we're finally getting noticed. And then some of the releases, when Korg released the ARP line again, that was when, it wasn't me, it was someone else who kind of done some digging through some popular websites to sell equipment. And we figured out what the launch was, what the price was. We snuck it out before the official launch. And then it became a place where, to get more information ahead of time. It kind of added a little bit of credibility to it. I reached out to guys like, Dave Smith of Sequential Circuits or Dave Smith's Instruments at the time, and said, hey, Dave, would you be interested in talking to the group? But having done very little AMAs, I thought that was a fun thing. And the amount of questions, it was amazing. Like a guy like Dave Smith, who is so influential in MIDI and, has been around forever. There was a lot of positive communication and guys saying, hey, Dave, I wish you were my dad, or, hey, Dad, can you give me one of these cents? It was really fun and really sweet to see the community being positive, reaching out like that in a very friendly, appreciative way. And now I don't know. I kind of left after having the first kid and just realizing I didn't have as much time. I took on a job with a company, kept me really busy, and I didn't have time. So I had to pull back. A lot of the rules that, I developed with the minimum moderators that we had at the time, they're still there. I just don't think that they're enforced, or maybe it's just so saturated now that there are over 100,000 users, maybe even 150,000 users or more. And I think people are gravitating away from these communities like Reddit. As handy as Reddit is, I don't think it's where people really want to go to talk about synthesizers.
Coming from the creator standpoint, someone who posts content everywhere, including in places like the synthesizer subreddit on the regular, I have a bit of a different perspective.
I get a lot of all different types of comments, but one that keeps popping up is the fact that Reddit used to be, it's all about reading things, Reddit, right? But then obviously content sort of evolved and changed, but there's still people that are stuck on the wanting to read everything. And so when you post video content, they're like, oh, Reddit's not a place for that. You know, originally it's for this. They're kind of like Reddit purists in a way, much like they're probably gear purists and like gatekeepers and all this kind of stuff, which that's just kind of their personality. But yeah, that's probably one of the most consistent comments that I get to discourage me from posting videos or basically showing my face. Like if I post a little performance clip where you don't see my face, oftentimes the video does well. But then as soon as I'm showing my face, like describing something or explaining something or whatever, giving an opinion, that's when people are like, they just dislike it.
The current bad guys of the synth gear industry, Behringer, they're definitely an important part of the synth gear space just because of the sheer size of the company. And they've gained this reputation over the years of basically just kind of being evil, especially to the little guys. I think that Mark and I sort of summed up the space that they take in the industry pretty well.
Speaking about Behringer, I have my own thoughts about Behringer. They're kind of a controversial company. I feel like if they're emulating stuff that no longer exists, like, you know, what is it, the RD9, RD8, like the 808, you know, the stuff that doesn't exist anymore, fine. But they're known to extinguish smaller companies and like steal their ideas.
When I chatted with Roland, I said, I think Behringer's eating your lunch. They're taking advantage and, you know, they're selling 303s and 808s and 909s. And who knows what else they're going to get their hands on. I got the impression from Roland, and it's more this Japanese idea, but I've seen it other places as well. Roland's interested in going forward. They're not interested in rehashing the same idea. Nintendo did the same thing. You know, Nintendo made it clear they didn't want to rehash their old games. They said, we're interested in moving forward.
Again, it's really not like Roland just completely ditched all of their classic Roland sounds. Quite the contrary, actually. Roland definitely are interested in moving forward, but in my opinion, specifically, they're interested in moving workflows forward. All of their sounds are being recycled, but again, presented in a more compact, integrated way. That's a lot of information to digest. Hopefully this was informative to you or made you think. Mark and my full conversation is over on Patreon if you'd like to check that out. A lot of our conversation we didn't really even touch on in this video. He's got a lot of little gems, a lot of experience, which goes back to, I guess, the 90s, like the beginning of the internet. If you're not interested in joining the Patreon, maybe you'd be interested in joining the Discord. So there's a link for that in the description of this video. Thank you guys so much for being here, and see you in the next one.